and he's been raised for our justification. So everything that's going on has been done by God, and that's what makes it acceptable and pleasing to him. The Bishop preached this morning that we've been made to be accepted in the beloved. In Christ God, we're acceptable to God in his beloved Son, and we're in his beloved, so now we're accepted. For whom he did foreknow, he also did predestinate to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brethren. Moreover, whom he did predestinate, them he also called, and whom he called, them he also justified, and whom he justified, them he also glorified. So God predestinated, he called us, he justified us, and he glorified us. That had nothing to do with what we did. And that was all God's idea. So once God conveys to me what he has in mind for me, the individual, and through the body that he created for himself, it's my responsibility to make sure that I make my body align itself with whatever God's will is. And when I do that, I allow the blessing of the Lord to operate in my life. Even if I'm positionally in Christ, if I operate outside of the method that God has outlined for me, the blessing of Christ that I have, my inheritance, it won't work in my life. I'll just possess it, but I'll never access it and manifest it outwardly for other people to see. And if I'm trying to get the message of Jesus Christ out to the masses, if I don't show forth what's inside of me, all of those people will never see the glory of God in my life. That's why I have to be crucified with Christ. Because if I crucify myself with Christ, if I'm crucified with Christ and I present my body a living sacrifice, then God is subject to do anything through my body. And I don't want to be in a position where I limit what God can do in my body and through my body. But I want to be available and completely free and in a position where the glory of God can come out of me in such a way that people come running to Christ to find out who he is. Now, I have as my subject rich for a reason. In my subtopic is putting Christ on display. My whole lifestyle is really catering to God's agenda as much as possible and dying to myself as much as I can day by day. And I'm trying to get as much of me out of the way as possible, because when I do that, I can put Christ on display. So when the blessing of God makes me rich, if I haven't been practicing renewing my mind, then when I get it, I'll consume it on my lust, and the people that I'm supposed to evangelize will never have the chance to see the salvation of God that's in me. One thing I noted in Romans 8 says that we've been predestinated to be conformed to the image of his Son. Romans 12:1 says, be not conformed to this world. So you always got two choices in front of you. God's agenda is you look like Christ. I'm going to conform you to that image. Satan's agenda is I'll create this world system that makes you look like a person that I want you to be. The key is to access God's plan so you'll know what you're supposed to look like. But you won't ever know what you're supposed to look like if you don't do the first thing, which is to be crucified with Christ. So if you seek the blessing of God or the material blessing of God and try to bypass being crucified with Christ, you can have blessings here and there, but not have the blessing of God. You'll have material things. And Bishop mentioned it this morning in Psalm 73. You see the blessing of the wicked, or the prosperity, the material things that the wicked acquire. But one of the things I saw in there was that they acquired it the wrong way. They didn't have the blessing of God, and then their end was that they were cut off. What happened was the righteous that was describing this in Psalm 73 was starting to envy the prosperity of the wicked. But until they came to the sanctuary of God and considered the wicked's end, they're going to be cut off. And it says even that they was ashamed when they realized that they were envying somebody that was actually cursed, that was cut off from God. So you can have somebody who the blessing of the Lord has made rich, and then you can have somebody that's just made rich. But if you detach the blessing of the Lord with the riches, you get a fool with riches who ultimately are going to be consumed by what they have because they didn't get it the correct way. And also, a person who is elevated to the place where they got a lot. Materially, they have a lot of influence. They have a lot of power. They get to that position without having the blessing of the Lord. They subject to put anything on display. They'll start putting themselves on display. So when that influence that they have goes out and people start to heap praises upon them, they'll take that glory and just put it in themselves. And that glory really belongs to God. They're supposed to give it to God, and then God will send more down for them to sow out and bring more people in. But some people just elevate, and the glory comes in, and then people praise them, but their head gets bigger rather than God being magnified. They magnify themselves. But you can only have the presence of mind to glorify God if you are dead. That's why you had to be crucified with Christ. That's the first order of business. Let's go to 1 John 4:4. 1 John 4:4.